Twice a year, I would take a trip to the creek about 30 minutes south of the small town where I grew up. I probably should have been making a conscious effort to go there more often, but in between schoolwork, a part-time job, and taking care of my mom, that proved to be difficult. I really liked the time I spent here. The slow and steady stream of water that cascaded over the rocks, the buzzing of the cicadas in the trees, and the faint hum of the cars driving on the nearby highway were calming. All of these things combined produced a melody of sounds not silent enough to give me angst, but not loud enough to remind me of the commotion of my disorderly home life. Sunset was closing in, and I knew that the cicadas' buzz would soon transform into the chirping of crickets, so I had to be quick about getting back to the main road. As I stumbled my way across the rocks in the creek, then crunched the dead leaves and branches below my feet in the dirt, I suddenly heard a sound coming directly east from me. It resembled the voice of a human, most likely a woman, and it didn't have any panic or fear in it, but rather comfort. I wasn't particularly fond of the idea of going back into the deep woods just for the slight chance that someone was in danger, and not the more obvious possibility of someone trying to kidnap me, but the thought of becoming a local hero and finally getting attention from my peers made me unable to resist. I made my way towards the direction of the sound, and it became louder and louder. Then I could start to make out the word that was being said. When I finally reached its origin, I found myself in the presence of a mysterious figure, an ominous being that resembled more of a shadow than a human, since its entire body was pitch black. And all the figure kept repeating was one word: silence. That was the last thing I remembered happening that night. I woke up feeling like I had been put through a dryer turned to the heavy-duty setting. As I slowly opened my eyes, I was surrounded by even more figures, which led me to believe I really did get kidnapped by a band of shadows. But when the figures came into focus, I realized I was in my bed, surrounded by my two younger brothers, older sister, and my father. "I found you unconscious laid out in the front of our yard last night," my dad said. "The front yard? How did I end up there? And what happened in between then and the time I saw the figure?" I sat up, raised my head off the pillow, and said, "Dad, I honestly don't know what happened. One moment I was in the middle of the creek that I always go to, and the next I'm in bed having this conversation with you guys. I swear I didn't take any drugs. You know I don't do anything like that." It seemed as if no one had heard me, or they were all too stunned with my story to speak. But their sullen faces suggested that their minds were preoccupied with something else entirely. "Son, your mother passed away last night. She fought long and hard over these past couple years, but when I went to check on her this morning, her breathing had stopped." As soon as I heard the words "passed away," I didn't even comprehend the rest of my dad's sentence. My vision got blurry. My heart started pounding from my chest, and my face started to swell into a dark red. My mom had always been the most important person in my life. She was the one to console me and always gave me the best advice in times of struggle. Whenever I would get bullied by the popular kids in my high school, she'd always say to me, "Remember, how they're treating you is really just a reflection of how they feel about themselves. Always keep that in mind when someone tries to badmouth you." She was always giving to others and never spoke bad about anybody. So she was the last person that I thought would ever receive bad luck. One day, while she was driving my younger brothers to soccer practice, a large truck tried to make a light that had already turned red. My mom's car was halfway into the intersection, and the truck ended up smashing into the front of it. While my brothers managed to come out of the wreckage unscathed, my mom ended up getting hit pretty badly. And since that day, 2 years ago, she had been in a comatose-like state, unable to move from the neck down or speak. "Billy," my brother said to me as his eyes swelled up, Why do bad things happen to good people? Why is the world full of so much evil?" It reminded me of what he had said to me the day of the actual crash, but this time, I could not find any words to respond to him. The silence of the room was starting to make me nauseous. In fact, I couldn't stand it. I was so overwhelmed that, in an instant, I threw the covers off of my bed, ran out of my room, grabbed my shoes, and busted through the front door of the house. Before my family could even think of catching up with me, their yells had grown quiet due to the distance I had already covered. I was sobbing uncontrollably. My mind started racing with negative thoughts, all the insecurities that my mom had helped me fight off, the bad experiences I had with the girls in my grade, the failed test, and the ever more apparent truth of my inevitable death. I didn't have a destination in mind when I started the race to escape my reality, but in the midst of the chaos, I knew where I had to go. I had to go back to that creek and find out what the hell happened to me. I was still around 10 minutes from reaching the entrance to the forest, but my out-of-shape lungs and legs reduced me to a slow walk. Since I didn't have enough time to gather the usual items I'd bring to the creek, which included my headphones, I realized that I had to face 10 whole minutes of silence. I absolutely despised any activity that didn't allow me to distract myself from the ongoing chatter in my head. It wasn't always like this, but ever since my mom wasn't able to produce speech while I watched her lay motionless in bed, I had grown a malevolence towards the quiet. For the first few weeks after the accident, I'd pull up a chair next to her bedside, hoping that some mysterious fairy dust would come down from the ceiling and cure all of her injuries. I'd tell her about my day, how much my siblings were getting on my nerves, and how it felt like my dad was always too busy with my younger brothers to offer any advice. But every single time I thought that this might be the time she responds, she didn't. So I gave up on visiting her room daily and swore to never allow myself to be haunted by the silence of the world again. I managed to find a pretty clever way of shrouding the quietness by kicking the small pebbles that fell off the side of the road until I got close enough to hear the stream. Then, with a mix of caution and excitement, I stepped onto the dirt path and into the woods. It began like any other time I had gone down this path. I'd look for the thin tree that bent into a gate-like shape, take a left after passing through it, and then a right once I saw the rock I had marked with a highlighter several years ago. But as soon as I had passed that rock, something happened. Everything amongst this dry, near-leafless forest looked exactly the same, but I was unable to hear the flow of the stream just a few paces to my right. I tried seeing if two bugs had simultaneously flown into my ears, or if my poor hygiene around that area had finally caught up to me, but my fingers revealed nothing after I scoured through the holes for a few seconds. I tried stomping my feet on the ground. I tried yelling, but nothing was generating a wave of sound that could hit my eardrums. One of my 5 senses had been completely cut off. Before I started to panic at all the crazy shit that had happened to me lately in this forest, I calmed myself and remembered the task I came here to complete. There was no going back until I figured out what happened to me last night. As I grew closer and closer to the detour trail that was connected to the main path by the stream, I habitually tried to hum my mom's favorite track from the 60s, California Dreamin' by the Mamas and the Papas. But instead, I was halted by a deafening loudness. The thing was, though, I was still unable to hear. All the sounds I was experiencing were coming from my mind. Everything I had been suppressing, the emotions I didn't want to show in front of my dad, the trauma from the accident, and the voice within that critiqued every bit of my personality was now inescapable. I became painfully aware of just how badly keeping a TikTok running in the background as I washed my hands after a dump was affecting my ability to gain self-awareness. I feared the ongoings in my mind so much that they had created their own utopia of hell beyond the usual realm of consciousness I had access to. And now, in my worst moment, I had to come face to face with it. They all spoke to me at once. "Billy, why are you so afraid of working hard and standing out? Billy, you know what Sabrina said about your acne scars is true, right? Hey Billy, you look like an absolute dork in that oversized shirt. You'll never be good enough to make the varsity soccer team. Just put your head down, shut up, and make sure you're fitting in." I formed my hand into a fist and bashed my head several times, being deluded into thinking that it would somehow help. Who were all these voices? I mean, surely they exist inside my mind, so they must be me, right? Well, the truth was that they were me, but my identity up until this point had been created by the opinions of others. Since I did not have the strength to sit in silence for extended periods of time, I was programmed to use the opinions that others had of me to form the idea of Billy, because those were the easiest and most believable opinions of myself to form. I could never truly know who I really was, how I really felt about myself, or what I really wanted, because that required me to look within and evaluate what I wanted to create from my reality. In fact, I had never once taken my own advice. On the occasion that my mind would try to give me advice, I would discard it, go to my mother, and believe what she said over any of my own potential paths or solutions. All of who I was and everything I'd ever done was none of my own doing. I sat there for a moment, contemplating how powerful this revelation was, and how stupid I felt for having never understood this earlier. And although my habitual fear response to silence told me to get out of my mind as quickly as possible, I pushed through the resistance, sat down next to the creek, and kept going deeper. I was under the impression that silence was just emptiness. What could I possibly learn from something so boring that gives nothing of substance in return? But in fact, silence and space are a necessity for anything to come into being at all. Without the silence between notes, music would just be one big wah. It only becomes music because of the pauses between those notes. In the same way, any object that we see out there in the universe is only perceived to be separate from every other object because of the empty space surrounding it. I pondered for a minute where I could have gotten that idea from, then it registered to me that I had seen it on a TV program my dad was watching while I scrolled through my phone. What other unconscious information and wisdom could I dig up if I gave myself more time to think in silence? I wondered. It was like my perception had completely changed. By turning off one of my senses against my own will, I was tapped into the infinite fountain of ideas that could only be accessed in complete stillness. I was convinced that silence was the source of all my unhappiness, but in fact, it was the key to figuring out how to deal with that unhappiness all along. I got up and stretched my legs, thinking whatever odd occurrence had caused me to lose my hearing, although I did start to hope it wouldn't last forever. After my brief but impactful pause, I continued on my journey to the part of the woods where I had seen the figure. And along the way, I stopped to take a deeper look at my surroundings. I was unable to use the sounds of the forest and the highway nearby as a distraction to escape from my issues, so I decided to carefully observe the present moment. It was like I was viewing a different forest entirely. I saw each individual texture on each tree's bark and how they almost resembled the veins underneath our skin. I let the sun in the sky glimmer through the leaves that swayed back and forth over my face and admired the beauty of the effortlessness of nature. By letting itself be undisturbed, much like a human who sits in silence, all of nature was exactly where it needed to be. It was in no rush to be somebody or something else than whatever it was right now. From this, I realized that human beings are the only living species on the planet that finds it necessary to ask, how do I be what I already am? This silent time of unplugging from it all. Holy shit, it's incredibly powerful, I thought to myself. And I knew this thought was really mine, because soon all those negative opinions and advice from others started to quiet down, and a newer, more kind voice emerged from them. Before I knew it, I was just a few steps from exactly where the figure was standing last night, but to my surprise, all traces of its presence were gone. I could have sworn that whatever that thing was the thing behind my hearing loss, and that it was the one who led me here to give me the answer to my life that I had always been looking for. But when I arrived, it left me stranded. Feeling rather frustrated, although much less frustrated than usual, I kicked the dead leaves and dirt on the ground below me, and when I did, I heard a large thump. I looked down and moved my foot, which revealed a pink portable cassette player with the tape already in it. As I smiled and picked up the player, I put its small speaker next to my ear, and it started playing the song California Dreamin'. I ended up regaining my hearing as soon as I returned home from the forest. Ever since that unexplainable occurrence, I've made a conscious effort to sit in silence for at least 30 minutes a day, but ideally as much as possible when I can. I became more confident that the opinions I held about myself and the actions I would take were truly my own. And whenever I questioned or doubted myself, I would take some time in silence to observe the goings-on of my psyche and let whatever needed to come to the surface come to the surface. There have been few practices as effective when it comes to improving my emotional control and volatility as this. Before I let myself act on impulse, I will allow a brief moment of silence and ask, is my response to this going to be beneficial to others or myself? And if the answer is no, I will simply stay quiet until my anger, frustration, or emptiness subsides, or until I can form a rational answer. By listening in silence, more than speaking just to avoid feeling awkward or looking unknowledgeable, I am able to understand others' true intentions and catch more of what is necessary. No matter what life throws at me, or how much my mind tries to tell me I am all the negative shit that's happened to me in the past, I now know that the real answer lies within the silence. Because ideas and solutions are found in space, not in substance. It's obvious to me now that the figure from that night was my mom. I guess it must have been her way of trying to give me advice, even from whatever realm her consciousness lies in now. So thanks for giving me that lesson from the afterlife, Mom. Now, I'm good to figure things out on my own. I just wish I could have shown you what I've accomplished from it so far.